one of the key things that new defense companies and defense companies in general have to do is constantly be talking to your customers around what is achievable, what are the new techniques, what is the latest and greatest from the high-tech community that can be brought to bear against the problems. If you're too late, know that you're walking up a hill with a lot of rocks in your shoes. At this point, after 2 decades of this, I've become a bit pessimistic that miracles don't really happen, and actually it's just hard work.
Hey, this is Ryan Clennell with the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, joined here today with Matt Steckman. Matt, how you doing?
Hey, good, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation. You wanted to start off just giving a quick intro and background of yourself?
Yeah, my name is Matthew Steckman. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Anduril Industries. Anduril focuses on bringing defense products to government. We've made a name for ourselves principally in 2 places, advanced command and control of robotics and the mission autonomy, or the way that those robots move throughout the world and throughout the environment, the software and the hardware that enables those things to be brought to life. So it's been a pretty crazy ride. We're over 3,000 people, about 7 years into this journey, hopefully only up to go. Prior to that, worked at Palantir Technologies, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, bringing lots of different types of software to government, but principally on the data analytics front and data integration front. And then did a quick stint at Zipline International, where we flew an automated drone network to deliver cold chain dependent medical products. So spent a good portion of my time in emerging markets within that role.
Awesome. Yeah. So 3 major startups on the resume. That's pretty cool and unique. What's that life like? I mean, constant just fending and battling for funds and trying to make things happen and iterating and being innovative. Like, talk to me a little bit about the startup life.
It is. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for, I think, those who can't handle a good amount of day-to-day chaos. Often I describe it as there's a lot of roles where you can be excellent, but that excellence is kind of running an existing set of complex machinery. And startup life is building that complex machinery in the first place. And so it's a bit of a different way to think. I think that a lot of folks come to startups thinking that they understand what that means and the chaos involved, and sort of the old adage, you learn more in 5 years than 15 years in other positions. I think academically you can probably understand that. I think once you're on the inside of it for 20 years, like I have been privileged to be a part of, it's almost hard to describe in a way. But I wouldn't sacrifice it for anything. I've learned more in those 20 years than I could have possibly dreamed of at the outset. And I'm still super excited every day when I get to Anduril, and excited about the things that we're getting after.
Awesome. And just my own curiosity, coming in from maybe your personal perspective, like employee number 6 or 600, like where were you in that entry level of coming into Anduril?
Yeah, I think sort of when we were 20-ish, somewhere around there. So I was the first hire in Washington, D.C. We ran all of our D.C. operations out of my house, actually, for the first year. Wow. Which was fun. I have a software background, and can kind of get away with that for a while in software, but in hardware, it's just a totally different ballgame where your house becomes the storage warehouse for your company. Which on the family front can only last you so long, right? Until you get told you have to become a real boy and grow up and get your own office.
That's hilarious. No, very cool. You mentioned before we jumped on just this idea of you being responsible for capital in terms of having to predict potentially where sales and the direction of government might be going. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, we all have our own kind of lenses that we view businesses from. As the chief revenue officer, I mainly think about capital in, capital out, capital allocation as the way we succeed or we fail. So our business is a bit different than a traditional defense business. We put a lot of capital out there into the world in the form of internal research and development, or IRAD, as it's known in the community. A huge percentage of our book looking more like the profile of a high-tech company than a defense company. That risk is all taken on Anduril's books, and then that risk has to pay off. And the more we are right, the more successful we are, the larger we can grow. The more we are wrong, the more punitive that becomes. And so we have to be right a lot. And I think that uniquely so as a company, we have a very interesting capital allocation process. It's very inductive. It requires the opinions of lots of different people throughout the company, including myself. And we all look at the problems and the market through a slightly different way. And I think that consensus is ultimately really, really powerful for making the right allocations, the right bets on technology trends and product trends that we're seeing.
Yeah. How do you like navigate your way through the overwhelming amount of, I don't want to necessarily say innovation theory, that's the word that's coming to mind, but like, we're really good about telling the world about all the good things that we're doing. But when you actually like dig deeper, this is Ryan's perspective, those things aren't actually all as great as they seem. And so like, as someone who has to sort of predict which ones may pan out in terms of future of government, like how are you actually navigating that?
Yeah, it is a multivariate variable problem, as you could well imagine. I think from my own lens, I look at three things. I mean, it's probably like 100 things, but let's just, just for the sake of conversation, we can be a little bit reductionist. So the first is, do I have a technical tailwind? And I think for Anduril, that means our software gives us an advantage over anyone else. So does the automated and autonomous command and control software, does the mission autonomy and robotic control software give me a tailwind against everybody else? And the reason that is, I think, key for me above all is because we're still a small company relatively, and because we're still new relatively in the defense community, literally everything else is a headwind in a government acquisition. And so I need to be really darn sure that I have a tailwind that gives me really a multiple year advantage in some cases over everyone else. That's one. The second, and you use the term innovation theater, I think that's the correct one. You tend to find that there's less of that where the problem is urgent, where there are operational commanders screaming for it, where there are program executive offices screaming for it, where there is the Congress screaming for it. In those urgent sets of problems, you tend to find more focus. You tend to find extremely high calibered individuals that just want to solve the problem quickly. So we look for that. And then the third, and I think that this is really important and something that's often missed by new players in the defense world, is even if you have those first two things going for you, is the structure of the government set up to ultimately bear the cost of that program in the early years and then in the out years in perpetuity? How serious are the government players in terms of their budgeting, their thinking, their maturity? And are you going to do this thing? And is it going to be funded consistently? The death knell, particularly to a small company or startups in the defense world, is, can I forecast my book of business on a year-to-year basis? And if you can't, you're dead. And so you have to look structurally at the durability of those contracts and at the revenue that it presents your company. So it's those three things. Those three things are actually really hard to measure. You need a lot of perspective and a lot of conversations with a lot of different people that surround the problem you're going after to really try and get you conviction that this is a program that you should put your own money and your own risk on the line for.
Yeah, no, I like that, and it's kind of driving my brain to think of some additional things that I want to pick yours on. here, which is like, so everything you're saying, it makes you're effectively trying to predict what the demand signal would look like in the future, and then build products, software, hardware around solving those problems, which is a reframe, right? Because typically we live in this requirements driven, where some O6 or above says, I need this, and everyone reacts to that message. How do I want to ask this? How often are you frustrated by seeing something like RFP or a solicitation that's close to what you offer but isn't exact, and you potentially wish there was some market research done so that they knew your product existed, or you have to react to that demand signal because that's the way people typically have done business?
Yeah, I guess the answer is a bit of like, if I'm seeing it in an RFP and I haven't already gone in and had the conversation around what's the state of the art, what's achievable within the timeline requirements and budget that office cares about. I mentioned headwinds earlier. Well, then I know I have every headwind against me because someone else has already been there having that conversation. I think one of the key things that new defense companies and defense companies in general have to do is constantly be talking to your customers around what is achievable, what are the new techniques, what is the latest and greatest from the high-tech community that can be brought to bear against the problems. And if you're too late, know that you're walking up a hill with a lot of rocks in your shoes. Not that it's impossible. Sometimes you have some breakouts where you kind of send in a flyer and miracles happen. But at this point, after 2 decades of this, I think I've become a bit pessimistic that miracles don't really happen, and actually it's just hard work. And so at Anduril, we focus a ton on just being out there and present and talking very matter-of-factly around technology and its implications for different classes of products.
Got it. Let's dive into the tech a little bit. Advanced tech, Gen AI, any of those things. Anything that excites you in the technology world today that you want to talk about, or where do you see us going in next year, 5 years, things like that?
Oh, tons of things. I think we should definitely talk about generative AI. It's kind of hard not to in a conversation like this. I think maybe for the listeners, an important lens that I view the world from and Anduril views the world from is we build weapon systems. So if a technology isn't mature and isn't knowable and understandable and testable, we won't use it because we know our customers won't use it. Now, that doesn't mean we can't use the latest and greatest techniques, but it does mean in many cases that if we're doing something that is net new with technology in government, we also have to think through, okay, what is the testing framework? How do we work with their certifiers to understand everything about how this new piece of tech, whether it's AI or not, will perform in the real world once it leaves your lab and in your desk? Completing the swing on tech in defense is hard. It's even harder when it's a weapon system. And so we don't take that lightly. Yes, I'm very excited about generative AI in weapon systems. There's some interesting stuff we should talk about, maybe some of the things we're thinking about. I think ultimately what ends up being harder is the entire systems integration problem. Understanding where to apply new technology, be it Gen AI or some other new technique, very pragmatically over an entire kill chain where you might have dozens of different technologies that have to be linked together to actually perform an effect. That systems level problem, I think, is the hard part. And then the adoption thereafter, the testing thereafter, and the real nug work of working with government to get it into the field, that stuff's really hard.
You mentioned Gen AI and weapon systems. Let's talk about it. What's the state of tech that we can talk about on a line like this?
Yeah, I think in general, it's important to remember that we are at not even the 1 yard line of a 100-yard dash here. I think we're in the ARPA, DARPANET stage of Gen AI, probably. We're like pre-Netscape internet days, wherever you want to put it on the timeline. There's new LLMs being produced by major companies. It seems like weekly at this point. I just read a thing that, you could easily predict that models even a few years from now could require $500 billion of infrastructure to run on. Which is unbelievable things that it's hard to even fathom how it's going to come together. And so I think in general, we don't think that it's ready for prime time in defense and in weapon systems. I think that would be, a bit too loose with what is a really complex and not so understood set of techniques. I think maybe, there are things on the mission planning side that are interesting to talk about. Non-Anduril use cases for sure. Things around just the interpretation of unstructured information. Absolutely. We should start to experiment. If we don't experiment, we're going to be behind. We definitely can't be behind. But otherwise, we need to be really sharp in terms of the thesis by which we determine whether we're going to experiment, not experiment, deploy, not deploy.
How much are you experimenting and using like the simulation world to test a lot of your products?
Absolutely. So we invest a ton in core modeling and sim tech so that we can just do a ton of operational understanding, ops analysis, as folks call it in the department, but do it in real world environments, simulated, of course, with real physics. It's the only way to get two things, I think. The repetition you need to really understand how all of these objects are going to function in the real world. But then even further, it's the only way to understand how complicated some of these things actually get, where you can be talking to a customer and show a demonstration of sort of a one-on-one style engagement, red versus blue. And it's very easy for a viewer to say, oh, like, I don't understand the need for automation and autonomy and AI. I could do that in my head. If through a learned process, and through a lot of conversations with a lot of government officials, once you show 100 on 100 or 1,000 on 1,000 or 10,000 on 10,000, it's the only way to really, I think, switch the viewer's mind to deeply appreciating how fragile the human mind is and why we need computer-aided decisions when the fog of war takes place and when the number of objects in the environment reach a scale that you just can't process anymore. I think our investments in modeling and simulation are starting to get at that. It's a huge amount of our IRAD, that customers don't even ever see. Right? We just do it for ourselves to better understand our own technology. And I think it's going to be increasingly more important as there's a robotic explosion on the battlefield to use these types of tools to really understand at scale what these robots need to be doing, how they need to be coordinating, and what intent a commander should and shouldn't have over those robotic swarms. What's the right level of human-derived rules for those robots to be following and guided by? All of these things are undecided. I don't think anybody can give you a definitive answer for anything, which is correct, because we're just at the very start here. But we're going to need really strong tools to model and understand these things over time.
Do you have at least, your perspective approach? So, obviously Anduril, one company, you talked earlier about system of systems and creating the entire kill chain. Like, what's success look like there? Like what would it take to get to success there in terms of setting up the entire strategy so that we successfully roll out the tech like Gen AI and can integrate the companies, and the solutions and the weapon systems? Just curious what your thoughts are there.
I think the key is not any one thing. It is the velocity that you can change in the system. So if a kill chain has several dozen steps with several different technologies that link those steps together, you have to realize that none of those steps in isolation matters in terms of the underlying technology. That the only thing that matters is how fast I can replace that step with whatever is the next best thing that's coming down the line, and how fast I can trust the entire kill chain to then be revalidated, retested, and redeployed. In my opinion, and I think in Anduril's opinion, velocity is the only thing that will matter, and the different parts of your system. We deploy some software systems that have reasonably 200-300 different sort of like microsystems or subsystems to them. Not any one of those things matters. The only thing that matters is we have a deep understanding of what's needed for each of those components, and we can swap it out rapidly, whether that's with our stuff or someone else's stuff, whatever is the best. Because ultimately, the hard part is that systems problem and not the individual components. And so I think the key for the department is to invest in these core platforms, these core technologies, to allow that fast swapping, testing, and fielding, and to ultimately hold an entity accountable to making sure it actually works when the warfighter needs it. All of those things are super hard to do. I think in principle, there's a lot of good and important movements happening in the department right now around openness, around how acquisitions are done to require openness. I think the next evolution in this is how do we hold an entity accountable so that when these hundreds of different subsystems have to come together and work, there is a belly button, there is an accountable entity to making that systems level thing go.
And do you think that belly button is a government, or do you think it's a major prime?
So in my experience, it's super important that the government has the stick for the outcome that they want and the outcome that they want generated. The second that stick is handed off, all kinds of misincentives start to take place. I think there are versions of the world where the government has the stick, but an entity is making those movements and held accountable to the outcome that the government cares about. Lots of words and ink have been spilled about sort of outcomes-based contracting over the last really 10 years or so. You've been a part of it. And you're just starting to see the fruits of that in different contracts, I think, around the community. But I think that's the natural balance of things. And that's the way that real and important work gets done. I think Anduril has some demonstrated successes there. I think there's some other important successes there as well that other companies have demonstrated.
Awesome. So, crazy kind of mission set that you have, and also adding the layer of, I'll say, the differences in how you operate with effectively at risk, kind of developing product and trying to predict solutions. What's hiring like? Like what do you look for when you're bringing new folks into this space?
Yeah, it's really hard. I think just for the audience, we hire everything from sort of your traditional high-tech software engineers from the major corporate and commercial players to high-end systems engineers from the traditional defense primes to everything in between. The key that we have found, I think interestingly, the personality trait that defines success for us or not, and this is a little bit trite, but I think it's correct, is grit. So because we're still small, because everything is a headwind to us, except for our technical differentiators, nothing is going to feel good or easy or in control. You're never going to feel like you have enough time to deliver. You're never going to feel like you have a big enough team to deliver. And so the binding trait for success at Anduril, and I think success at just startups in general, is grit. Can I figure out a way to overcome the market headwinds to still win? Because that's what I care about, and that's what I'm passionate about. We end up doing pretty well in recruiting. I would say sort of winds are shifting in the defense and national security technology world. I think we're getting significantly more inbound, over the last couple of years than when we started the company, which is really exciting to see. I think we're creating an environment unique in defense that sort of is equal, maybe not equivalent, but has parity with high tech. And so we're able to recruit and retain talent that the defense market has maybe otherwise not had access to, which I think is really important. And then at the end of the day, what our customers see is a blend. They see a mix of faces that they never would have seen, prior to an Anduril, which is exciting. And then they see a series of faces that are deep subject matter experts in their problems. And that blend of both, I think, has been the winning combination for us.
Got it. No, I like that. Curious, in terms of grit being kind of your overarching answer, it's sort of a demonstrated thing, right? It's not really an interview answer that I can provide that is like, oh, wow, Ryan has grit, right? So what does that look like? And obviously at the level that you can talk about, but what does that look like going through a hiring action? How do you actually go beyond potentially what's being said in an interview to differentiate the people that actually have a success of winning versus the people that are just sound like they might?
Yeah, it's an interesting answer to your question, but I think it's the demonstration of outcomes outside of what you otherwise would have expected. And that last clause is important. So there are versions of the world where your outcomes are expected to be high end, but that's actually not interesting because the path of your life took you to the Ivy Leagues, took you to, your top MBAs, took you to top consulting or banking. And some of these really incredible outcomes, if you have the perspective of where did that person start and you're in an interview situation, maybe less interesting. Did that person at some point jump off of that sort of treadmill that was in front of them? And did they do something outsized, unexpected, performance against their, years in the job? And then the same thing, I think we do a lot of military and veteran hiring, the exact same principles. So absolutely incredible outcomes by, members of the armed forces. But sometimes you would expect those things. And sometimes you wouldn't. Right? And it's those times that are really interesting. And when you're interviewing someone, it's your job to understand where do they come from? If they just did what was expected of them, what would they have produced? And sometimes those things are incredible. Ignore how incredible that stuff is and figure out if they performed against those expectations in some way and dig in and really understand their contribution to it. If there's a binding sort of thread to, everyone we hire, and it's a lot of people at this point, so it's probably not super uniform, right? But it's that examination of prior performance and what that means about their expected future performance.
Yeah, awesome. Appreciate it. Do you have anything, going to switch gears a little bit, do you have any just overall, I guess it's kind of a two-part question. So we'll start with the first part, which is for someone that's interested in startup life, wants to, has an idea, wants to kind of kick off, has DoD as a potential customer, what kind of advice would you give them?
There's two versions of this. So there is the founder mode, right? And then there is if I just want to get involved in this type of community. And I think there's kind of different answers. So the get involved, there's a lot of companies now sort of principally doing work with the federal government. There's been a surge in investment over the last 5 years, for sure. My best advice there is literally just take a job. And if you're qualified for it or not qualified for it, the way that startups work is they bring you into a role. It's generally pretty loose in terms of where that role ends up. And so if you have a background that looks nothing like what a company would otherwise be hiring for, try and convince them to take you on for something. And then the amount of lateral movement you can do within a startup is sort of endless at that point. And then if you're good and you're a hard worker and your outcomes are there, sky's the limit. I get a lot of questions from folks that really have atypical backgrounds for startups. And that's the number one thing I say, just start. And, once you're in the community, it's hard to tell where you will end up. But if you do good work, the community will reward you for it. The founder piece, I think, is different. Doing work with the federal government is really, really hard. It's one of those areas, I think healthcare is probably similar, where if you yourself or your founding team doesn't have a background in it, it's really hard to figure it all out. And so if you are a technical potential co-founder and have not the slightest clue how to work with government, your job before founding a company is to find your co-founder that understands it. I think maybe 15, 20 years ago, the answer to that question in the startup world would have been different. It would have been, just start it. And if you're a smart person, you'll figure it out. I think with defense, particularly with defense, there are so many gotchas for small companies that doing it without that knowledge base, at least a set of advisors that understand it, super, super difficult. So think about all of the skills of that founding team: technical, market understanding, finance, government relations, and make sure you have it all. Even if you do, it's risk, right? It's hard to start a company and win. The probabilities are always against you, but you'll definitely have a whole lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, awesome. And so the second part of that advice question is a little related to working with government, but maybe specifically towards like the acquisition side of things. Any advice for those maybe smaller companies aspiring to be like Anduril or follow in footsteps?
I don't think there's a dark art to it. I think there's sort of a known set of things you need to go do. I think the more important part is understanding what those known set of things are. And so whether it's, again, having that, locally on your founding team, like that's always the best thing. I think at this point, though, there are a strong community of investors that have those types of networks that can get you smart and sharp on how to at least start. And then along the way, you'll meet lots of people from lots of companies that you should think about as your counsel. And each part of that counsel will have a little bit of a different lens in terms of how they view the world. And each of them is important, but none of them will be exactly right. And it's your job to talk to all of them and to figure it out.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Hey, getting close to time here. I do want to just give you an opportunity if you had anything else that you wanted to offer to the listeners before we close out.
Sure. I think that the reason we started Anduril was because we believed that there had to be, sort of another defense prime that thought about the world differently, that thought about software differently, that had a product focused view. I think increasingly, I am of the belief that the things that move the needles are going after like the home runs and not singles and doubles. So going after large programs. And what I've seen is even if we don't win, and obviously winning is great and we love the wins and that's been great and that's sort of fueled the company. But even if we don't win, if we're just in the competition, it makes everybody else up their game. It even makes the government up their game. And that is really, really meaningful. It means that, again, at least to me, that we're having an effect outside of our walls, outside of the direct impacts on our company's P&L. And that's super special. And it's the reason I'm here and we're excited about it.
Awesome. Hey, Matt, I appreciate you being on today. Hope the listeners get as much out of it as I did. So thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.